Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roland Smith, Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and Adjunct Professor of Sociology here at Rice. It is my distinct pleasure to moderate this session and as such, introduce our guest speaker today, Captain Paul J. Matthews. Captain Matthews is the founder and board chair of the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum located here in Houston. He has been researching military and history, collecting artifacts and memorabilia for over 30 years prior to founding the museum, which is the only museum in the United States that chronicles the entire African-American military experience from the Revolutionary War to the Persian Gulf. Over 60% of the museum's collections and exhibits have been donated through his private collection. Captain Matthews received his Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Prairie View A&M University, followed by active duty and reserve duty in the U.S. Army, where he received the Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal, and the Combat Medical Badge serving in Vietnam. Captain Matthews worked for 30 years at Merck & Company, where he served as a hospital representative, executive business manager, Director of Military Affairs, managing military division that yielded over $8 million in annual income. His tireless work has been recognized not only throughout the state of Texas, but also throughout the nation. On a personal note, he and I serve at two organizations that provide scholarships and college readiness activities to high school students from underserved communities, the 100 Black Men of Metropolitan Houston and Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. It is my pleasure to introduce Captain Paul J. Matthews, who will add his perspective on the significance of Juneteenth. Captain Matthews.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this celebration. And I think that I should start by saying that Juneteenth is a day to celebrate freedom. You know, it gives me an opportunity to honor those that came before me, you know, those that conquered slavery, because slavery in America is unprecedented in the history of mankind. You know, June 19th, 1865 was the day of liberation. Juneteenth then was the day the shackles were broken. Now, Juneteenth was the day slavery officially ended in Texas. Juneteenth was the beginning of freedom. Juneteenth then was the day you said, you know, I am somebody. So I celebrate Juneteenth to honor that legacy. And if you look back, you know, 155 years, you know, what do you see on each one of those Juneteenth days? You know, looking back at 1865, 1885, 1895, you know, 1965. Well, you see, you know, slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, legalized segregation, you know, civil rights movement, law and order, affirmative action. And today, June 19th, 2020, you know, what do we have? You know, many challenges to human rights. You know, but on the brighter side, today is a day of joy and happiness, but it's also a day to remember that the struggle continues. So I have several prepared remarks. I think I want to put that on the screen. So if I can get the shared screen here. You just look at the slide number 1, you know, to get a true understanding of Juneteenth, we need to place the 19th of June in its proper context. We need to examine what was going on before, during, and after this point in history. Number one, President Lincoln had signed his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, that freed the slaves in the southern states. Number two, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered his Confederate forces on April 9th, 1865. And finally, number three, General Joseph Johnson had surrendered the last major Confederate army on April 18th, 1865. So even though the end was clearly at hand, the Confederate forces in Texas ignored this fact and continued the war in the West. They organized a conference of trans-Mississippi states and held a meeting in East Texas, specifically in Marshall, Texas, on May the 13th, 1865. So this meant that the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln, nor the surrender of General Lee, had any practical meaning for the slaves in Texas. So Texas continued the war, but it could not last in the face of the diminishing troops and supplies. So under the pressure of superior federal forces, General Kirby Smith could not continue the war and surrendered the Trans-Mississippi Department at Galveston on June the 2nd, 1865. And according to Reverend C. Anderson Davis, and I quote, June 19th has no significance as an isolated occurrence. To have real meaning, it must be seen as the culmination of a series of historical events that give it credence. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, January 1863, the surrender of the Confederate forces, April 9, 1865, and the surrender of the Trans-Mississippi Department on June 2nd, 1865, are all linked together to produce Juneteenth, end quote. And speaking of Reverend Davis, Reverend Davis was the founder of the Juneteenth Freedom Festival. Reverend Davis came to Houston in 1969 for the purpose of reorganizing the NAACP. He devoted his life to helping all people pursue goals of hope for a brighter future. He was a noted African-American political consultant, NAACP leader, community activist, and the sole drafter of the Juneteenth Proclamation that was used by State Representative Lal Edwards from Sunnyside to make Juneteenth a state holiday in Texas. More about Representative Edwards a little later. But Juneteenth was the first official holiday in the nation for African Americans. So, I met Reverend Davis in the early 80s, and I served on the Juneteenth Freedom Festival board for several years. And, I learned a lot about Juneteenth from Reverend Davis. I learned a lot of Juneteenth from Reverend Davis. He taught me that Juneteenth is an American holiday. It came from one of the boldest and most destructive and yet most significant events in our history. It has special significance for the African American population because it symbolizes justice, liberty, and freedom. Now, unity of spirit and solidarity must become an integral part of our thinking and action before the celebration can have living reality. So Reverend Davis passed in 2007. However, the fruits of his labor lives on today through the many, many Juneteenth activities here in the city of Houston, across the state of Texas, and throughout America. So So the Honorable, my screen here. The Honorable Al Edwards introduced legislation that made June 19th a state holiday on June 1, 1979. Al Edwards was first elected to represent District 146 in the State House of Representatives in 1978. He served more than 30 years total in the legislature, first until 2007, and then again from 2009 until 2011. His most noteworthy achievement was the establishment of Juneteenth as a state holiday in Texas. You know, the holiday was a result of the House Bill 1016, introduced by Edwards when he was a freshman. Representative Edwards overcame tremendous opposition to the bill, in part by cutting controversial deals with political opponents. Representative Edwards attended Wheatley High School in Houston's Fifth Ward and also Texas Southern University. Al Edwards' thoughts on Juneteenth, and I quote, Al Edwards' thoughts, and I quote, every year we must remind successive generations that this event triggered a series of events that one by one defines the challenges and responsibilities of successive generations. That is why we need this holiday, end quote. And Brother Roland, you know, I think that we need to stop and examine that statement because this is the essence of our discussion. You know, he said every year, you know, not just this year or next year or last year, but every year. You know, he said that Juneteenth message must be successive, meaning uninterrupted. It must be consecutive. It must be continuous. So Juneteenth sparked a series of events. And what were those events? You know, civil rights activities, you know, affirmative action activity, you know, that one by one defines the challenges and responsibilities of successive generations. And that is why we need this holiday. So to the Reverend, the doctor, the brother, State Representative Al Edwards, you know, I am in total agreement with that, you know, statement. And here on your screen, you see some Juneteenth activities throughout the U.S., not just in the city of Houston and in the state of Texas. Juneteenth is celebrated in Houston and cities throughout America. The NFL announced on June the 12th that the league will recognize Juneteenth as a league holiday. All offices will be closed. Nike declared Juneteenth to be an annual paid company holiday in a memo dated June 13th, recognizing Juneteenth as a paid holiday for U.S. employees. Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter and Square, you know, tweeted on June 9th that both companies will honor Juneteenth as a company holiday in the U.S. You know, the Armistead Center for Art and Culture in Hartford, Connecticut, is presenting its annual Juneteenth Gala virtually today. The Armistead Center for Art and Culture, by the way, is the nation's oldest continuously operating public art museum and the first major museum in that region to house a gallery devoted to the subject matter of African American culture. The Martin Luther King Center, Community Center in Dallas, Texas, is hosting a drive-through Juneteenth celebration today. You know, attendees can drive through the MLK parking lot and receive free non-perishable food items, hygiene kits, and household products. Austin, Texas is hosting a virtual Juneteenth event, including barbecue, food distribution, musical performance, and online raffle. In San Antonio, Texas is hosting a virtual Juneteenth Texas Freedom Festival today. As a matter of fact, 48 states and the District of Columbia have passed legislation to officially recognize Juneteenth as a state holiday or special day of observance. On the screen, you also see a proclamation from the Honorable Kathy Whitmire in 1984. And she wrote, "I wish to congratulate the National Emancipation Association Juneteenth Committee for its work in organizing and promoting the 11th annual Juneteenth Festival." So Juneteenth is a special day not only for Houston Black residents, but for all citizens who value freedom as an integral part of our democratic society. Juneteenth is one of the most unique annual events in our city, and I encourage everyone to participate. And what is Juneteenth? And this is from the pages of the Galveston Daily News on June the 21st, 1865. On June 19th, 1865, 2 months after the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, Union General Gordon Granger and approximately 1,800 federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas to take control of the state and enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. General Gordon Granger read General Orders Number 3, and you can see it on the screen. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and the rights of property between former slaves, former masters and slaves, and the connection theretofore existing between them. This announcement freed more than 250,000 slaves in the state of Texas. So Juneteenth is commemorations and celebrations. We feature music, barbecues, prayer services, and other activities. The Juneteenth folklore and myth, I think we need to take a quick look at. Did the word get to Texas late? I hit that question all the time. If it didn't get here late, how did it get here? Well, in my humble opinion, the word didn't get to Texas late. The troops got here late. So, how did the word get here? Well, it got here through a lot of different mechanisms. The two most popular were the walking wounded. These were the Confederate soldiers that left the battlefield and came back to the plantation, and also through a very well-established plantation communication network. The picture you see on the screen, by the way, is from the National Archives and Records Administration, and it shows 5 generations in one family. A very popular picture you see in a lot of the Civil War pictures. Freedom delayed, political and legal. The freedom of 250,000 slaves in Texas was delayed, but it wasn't denied. The freedom was delayed by political and legal circumstances. As mentioned earlier, General Order Number 3, not the Emancipation Proclamation, freed the slaves in Texas. There are several reasons why the delay occurred, and they are legal and political and not due to the mode of communication as repeated by folklore. For example, a messenger may have been killed on his way to Texas with the news of freedom, or the news was deliberately withheld by the enslaver to maintain the free labor force on the plantation. Another example is that the federal troops waited for the slave owners to have one last cotton harvest before going to Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. None of that, however, is true. The real reasons are: one, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves, as the order was limited to the states that were in rebellion, who had formed the Confederacy and did not recognize the authority of Lincoln. It did, however, set in motion a process that led to the passage of the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery in America. Number two, the country was bitterly divided, and there were slave sympathizers not only in the South, but in the North as well. For example, on January 7, 1863, the Illinois legislature passed a resolution opposing the proclamation. And number three, finally, the Civil War was still raging. Lincoln's goal was to save the Union. In a letter dated August the 22nd, 1862, to Horace Greeley, a famous abolitionist. A portion of the letter is printed on the screen. It is in this political and warlike atmosphere that the Union Army went through the South, taking command of the states that were in rebellion. It was under these circumstances that John Granger arrived to take command of Texas on June 19, 1865. And that, my friend, was the beginning of Juneteenth and the Juneteenth celebration in Texas. A couple of other slides here. Listed here are emancipation dates in other southern and border states. I'll just list a few of them. In 1864, you had January 11th, the Constitution of Missouri was amended, abolishing slavery. And March the 14th, the Constitution of Arkansas was amended, abolishing slavery. In 1865, July 25th, John Hamilton, provisional governor, formally declared slavery abolished in Texas. And then finally, in December the 18th, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution adopted and slavery abolished in the United States. The border states, by the way, during the Civil War were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia. So one question I get all the time is, what role did the soldiers play in Juneteenth? Well, if you look at Section 9 and Section 10 of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, it clearly states that the slaves would be free when federal troops occupied the territory. And that occurred on June 19th, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger landed in Galveston, read the proclamation, but he had more than 300 Black troops with him to enforce the law. So that was the key to the Juneteenth. And many of the Black soldiers were from the 25th Army Corps that was formed with the U.S. colored troops. As a matter of fact, more than 27,000 U.S. colored troops served in Texas. The U.S. colored troop accounted for more than half of the initial Union troops in Texas. The soldiers were in Texas to maintain order and to assist with the Reconstruction era. The USCTs played a key role in early stabilization of Texas and the protection of the recently freed slaves. And for the purposes of this presentation, I think we ought to mention that they brought the word of emancipation to plantations throughout Texas. The Palmer Plantation in Missouri City, for example, they were there. In Fort Bend County, the Alta Vista Plantation in Waller County. The Alta Vista Plantation, by the way, is the present site of Prairie View A&M University. The Seward Plantation in Washington County, Levi Jordan Plantation in Brazoria County, and all other plantations and counties in the state of Texas. So, and then I'm not going to mention the sugarcane plantations in Sugarland that substituted convict leasing for the slave labor. Convict leasing was slavery by another name. And the two most egregious perpetrators of that was E.H. Cunningham and L.A. Ellis. And then my final slide, several key players in the Civil War was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass made a very important point at the start of the Civil War. Frederick Douglass said, and I'll paraphrase, give the colored man a uniform, a buckle with the U.S. on it, a button with an eagle on it, and a musket. And you will make him a citizen, but you also make him a man. Because what he was trying to do was make sure the Civil War was being fought for freedom. And the only way you can do that, you had to put the black man in the blue uniform. And then you had Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a spy, a nurse, a conductor of the Underground Railroad, and the only female in the history of the U.S. military to lead troops in the battle. And that record, by the way, lasted until the Persian Gulf War. And then finally, the U.S. colored troops. There were approximately 200,000 black men that served in the Civil War. And there were more than 175 regiments. A regiment, by the way, is about 1,000 soldiers. So that finishes my formal remarks. I can open up for comments and questions.
Well, thank you very much. And we have a couple of questions, but I wanted to start off by asking, so I think I know the answer, but what motivated you to start with your work with not only with Juneteenth, but also the foundation of the Buffalo Soldiers Museum?
Oh, yeah, I tell you, just with Juneteenth, I can just flash back to, when I was growing up in Lamarck, Texas, in the 50s. And we had Juneteenth activities, but it was mainly in our community. So we lived on a street called Jackson Street. Jackson, the street before it was Stonewall. So Stonewall Jackson, can you imagine that? So we had activities, and I guess it's the old anthem about being a village. Let me tell you about my street. On the corner was a labor lawyer, and next to him was T.J. Jackson, who was the principal of the school, the black school, because we were in a segregated situation at the time. And we had nurses, and my dad was a tavern owner and a carpenter. My uncle who lived on the street was a licensed plumber. So almost every profession that you wanted to be, was on Jackson Street. Mm-hmm. And when we got together for these events and activities, we would talk to and interview, and everybody had a focus. So, so the Juneteenth then was more about educating the youngsters and how to move forward. So that's how I remember, my early days of Juneteenth. But in reference to the Buffalo Soldiers, I first heard about the Buffalo Soldiers when I was a cadet at Prairie View A&M University back in the 1960s. And I read 2 paragraphs in one military book about the Buffalo Soldiers and became very intrigued about these black men in the blue uniforms, because they did what they did, not necessarily for themselves, but for those that came behind them. And so that led me to more than, now about 40-year journey of collecting artifacts, documents, memorabilia, that led to the exhibit that you see in the museum today. So it was a lifelong project that, I'm sort of semi-retired from that.
Well,
I still get called in to answer some of the questions, like the main one is, how did the Buffalo Soldiers get their name? And it came from the Cheyenne warriors. They saw two things in the soldiers that they saw in the buffalo. It was their naturally curly hair and their ferocious fighting spirit. And they put those two things together and they came up with wild buffalo. And the term wild buffalo eventually became, Buffalo Soldiers.
okay, great. I see a question here that asks, which states have not recognized Juneteenth?
Oh, I have to look back on that. I'm not sure.
Are a lot of them? I mean, it
No,
sounds like
I think it's more than, it can be more than one or two. I just don't have the list in front of me. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a legislation now to make it a national holiday. So there's a lot of movement going on now with the current situation, political situation that we're in.
Right. Let's see. There were. So it is. What are your thoughts? Wait a minute. Let me get this right here. Hold on. There was a question. There was actually more of a comment where one of the folks says that they are. Al Edwards, his father. I've actually talked about him going. He was a poll judge in the Black community, and it was talking about he and I guess Reverend Lal Richards Edwards were arrested, and apparently Reverend Richards was found hung. I'm not sure how that, but anyway, but just the point there is that one of the things that they wanted to stress was that to make sure that we bring our young people, our children, to the polls when we go voting and be involved in voting activities. Let's see if there were any other questions here. There were mostly comments. Let's see. So the question here was what? It's unbelievable that the news did not reach Galveston regarding the Emancipation Proclamation. And let's see. Yeah, and what is it? They said, is there documentation when the news actually hit Galveston?
Yeah, well, the documentation is in the newspaper.
Okay, that was the answer to that question.
Yeah, it was in the newspaper, but you can imagine that the news was there before even the newspapers, because of the Confederate soldiers coming back and forth, leaving the battlefield. So there was a lot of discussion going on. But even in some isolated plantation, there may have been an opportunity where the slaves did not know. So I mean, that's a strong possibility. Because even if you looked at some of when you listen to the narratives, the slave narratives that were taken back in the 1920s or so, and several of them talk about first hearing about the Emancipation Proclamation when the master gathered them all up on the porch and told them. So that did occur. But as a general rule, they knew. Right.
Yeah.
Even today, in 2020, some of us don't know that we're free.
Sure. And so we had another question that just actually was saying that they visited the Buffalo Soldier Museum and it was terrific. Another person asked about where the Buffalo Soldier Museum is. You can give the address.
3816 Caroline in the Museum District. Matter of fact, today they're having a reopening, the grand reopening. So, and it's free.
Mm-hmm. And that's an old armory too, isn't it?
Yes, it was built in 1925 by the National Guard unit that was there, the Light Guard. When the Union soldiers left Texas, after the period of Reconstruction, the Confederate soldiers started a militia, and the militia became the Light Guard, and the Light Guard became the National Guard. And the captain at the time when the museum, the armory was built in 1925 was James Baker. James Baker is it's the grandfather of Jim Baker, who was the former Secretary of State under Bush.
Right.
So it's a lot of history there at the armory. We bought the building from the city back in '08, and we raised $6 million to renovate the building, and we moved in 2012. And so we're finishing up the last phase of the operation on the third floor, hopefully in the next few weeks.
Okay, great. So here's a question that says, we often hear about Harriet Tubman, her role in helping slaves prior to the war. Could you elaborate on Harriet Tubman's role in the Civil War and in terms of her leading troops?
Yeah, like I said, she was a spy, a nurse, and a conductor of the Underground Railroad. She led a group, a squad in South Carolina in one of the battles there. So she wasn't a regular U.S. colored troop soldier, but she did have, I guess, a guerrilla group that she operated. So she wasn't an official soldier, but she was a spy, and she did lead troops. Quite a lady. We actually have Melissa Thibodeau, who does the reenactments of Harriet Tubman at the museum. So check the website and see when she's going to be there again.
Okay. I had someone saying that Hawaii, North Dakota, and South Dakota have not recognized Juneteenth.
Oh, yeah, good. I'll add that to my slide. But I don't think we would need that, because I think the national, it's going to be a national holiday. I just got the feeling for that. It was actually a dentist that lived in Alabama. I think he passed a year or two ago, that was leading the effort to make Juneteenth a national holiday. And so I think that's going to come to fruition. I'm surprised I didn't get any questions about the Native Americans. Usually when I give my talk, like one thing was the Seminole Negro Indians. When the slaves escaped from the plantation, many of them went north and northeast with Harriet Tubman, but some of them went south to Florida and on into the Caribbean. And those that stayed in Florida intermingled with the Seminoles and became the Seminole Negro Indians. And many of them became scouts for the Union Army after the Civil War. So that's one of the displays that we have at the museum.
Right. Okay. So now we said there was a question. Isn't the reason the word did not reach the enslaved people in Texas was because the white people did not want them to know?
And that's all folklore. Well, I mean, it didn't matter because they had no mechanism of enforcement. So
because I think what you were saying though, that people knew because through word of mouth,
right?
But it wasn't official. They knew that they were, but they couldn't.
It was nothing. It was nothing you can do about it. And when I give the tours at the museum, I kind of do a dramatic thing. Say, we're out in the fields picking cotton, and we hear about the Emancipation Proclamation. What do? Drop all our tools, go to knock on the front door and say, "Boss, we's free." They say, "No, you're not free." But what happened when the soldiers arrived in June 19th and beyond? When they knocked on the door, they had rifles in their hand. And so they were free. So it's just a matter of the ability to enforce. Just like the mayor of the city of Houston can't pass any laws for the city of Dallas.
Right.
It just doesn't work.
Okay, we've got there's a lot of comments. Let's see. Is the riots in the Tulsa a consideration for being in Juneteenth? I'm not sure. Yeah.
Very much.
Not sure what that. So
Yeah,
there are lots of different. There are a lot of comments. So I'm just thinking about. So one question is, do you think people should celebrate Juneteenth? And I think you've answered that.
oh yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's no
Uh,
doubt about it. You know, I think you mentioned of the riots, the one that most folks don't know about that happened right here in Houston with the Buffalo Soldiers, the 24th Infantry Regiment. So at the beginning
mhm.
of at the beginning of World War One, the city fathers here in Houston lobbied Washington to get a fort built. And they couldn't get a fort, they got a camp. It was called Camp Logan. It's where Memorial Park is now. Before Memorial
Wow,
Park was Memorial Park, it was Camp Logan. So they brought in the
wow,
3rd Battalion of the 24th Infantry Regiment to Houston, Texas to guard the camp while the workers were doing what they were supposed to do. Now, that was a tragedy waiting to happen because you brought these black soldiers to a southern town with strictly enforced Jim Crow laws. And as you expect, these Buffalo soldiers who had a history that goes back to the Indian Wars wasn't obeying these segregation laws. They wasn't sitting in the right section of the bus. They wasn't drinking from the right fountain. So there's a lot of conflict between the soldiers and the Houston police because the Houston police at that time pride themselves on enforcing the Jim Crow laws. And what happened on August the 23rd, 1917, word got back to Camp Logan that one of the men had been killed by the Houston police. Now, he wasn't killed, he was beaten up and thrown in jail. But this was a straw that broke the camel's back, according to one of the soldiers. They locked and loaded their weapons. They marched down West Gray, West Dallas, to what we call now 4th Ward. At the time was called the San Felipe District. And in between those 2 points, they killed 15 people, 5 of them being police officers. As a result of that, they put them on a train, took them to Columbus, New Mexico, which was the regimental headquarters of the 24th Infantry Regiment, and they took 63 of them to San Antonio to Fort Sam Houston, where they had a court-martial. And at the end of the court-martial, they hanged 13 of them. And then 6 months later, they hanged 6 more. So a total of 19 Buffalo soldiers were hanged as a result of the Houston riots of 1917, of what we call the Camp Logan incident. And that's another one of the exhibits that we have at the museum.
Okay, thank you. We've got lots of questions here. Many of them are comments. I'm not sure if I can get through all of them. We can look at them. But I think one question was, what does the, can you describe what the military looks like today racially?
Yeah, what's a minority? I think blacks are like 20 something, 25% of the military. A lot more black African American officers than they were then. So it's the military was actually ahead of the curve in integration, racial equality, and that's why the Buffalo Soldiers were, went into the services. But they were much more advanced they were on the vanguard of the modern day civil rights movement, the military. It's the old saying, in the military, not black or white, you're green. But you still have to, still was some prejudice there because you can't legislate, somebody's thinking.
Right. How are we doing on time here? I think we might want to get trying to think of this, a few more questions here. There's a lot of comments that some of them, here's one. This is, how and where did you get your artifacts?
Yeah. So I was a director of military sales for Merck. As a matter of fact, my claim for fame at Merck, I wrote the proposal that created the military sales division. And it's $1 billion division now. So I had responsibility for all the military installations in the US and Europe. So I traveled around the US and I went to, different meets, funerals that they were selling or giving away, documents from the grandma, grandpa died. And folks now just donate. I very seldom go out to look for things anymore because almost every week we get something from somebody. But I've been to almost every military post in the U.S. and some in Europe.
Okay. Great. I think so. Okay. Yeah, I think we've got a few others. Is there a book available that gives the history of Juneteenth with documents that you presented for young children to understand?
I don't. I would have to look and see that because my information I gathered was from several different sources.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to look and see if there's a book that's basically designed for the younger audience.
Well, if not, maybe that can be a project.
Yeah, you'll give me another project. I think you
well,
might.
yeah, I mean, not necessarily for you, but maybe get someone to do it. But that would be a great project.
I think that's an intern project. I'm definitely gonna look into that. That was an outstanding question because we need something. We always say we need to pass things on to the younger generation, and then we never give them anything to go on. So yeah, right. That's a project that I'm definitely going to be looking into.
Okay.
Because most of the things that I said today came from, Attorney Williams, the attorney in Galveston, the National Archives and Record Administration, the Galveston Daily News, the Negro Yearbook from 1921, Dr. Charles Taylor, Juneteenth is always right to celebrate freedom. So it came from several different sources.
Yeah. So I think there was a question here that do you know of any movement to change the name of Dowling Street in the 3rd Ward?
It's already been changed.
I thought, I was thinking that it had been Emancipation
Boulevard.
Boulevard. Yeah, that's what I thought.
That's and Dowling was a major street. When I was going to Prairie View in the early 60s, we used to come to Houston, and that was our first stop before we went over to Texas Southern, because anything you wanted, you could find it on Dowling. They had a savings and loans there. They had liquor stores. They had restaurants, barbershops, all the way from Sophomore to the Interstate 45. So.
Right.
But it's changed. The name has changed, and it's been several months since that happened.
Okay.
All right.
Like I said, well, thank you. I think there are so many questions we can't get to them all, and I think we're gonna have to maybe respond to some of them. And many of them are comments thanking you for your presentation today and for the discussion. So. On behalf of Rice University and all of our community, I want to thank you for being with us today and sharing with us this rich history and your perspective.
You're certainly welcome, and look forward to seeing you later. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.